Well, let's get into some of these questions. We're going to start off with a banger here. We're going to talk about the best ways to prevent soreness. So this question was actually longer about, how do you prevent soreness from like BJJ, CrossFit, etc. And I just simplified it. The best ways to prevent soreness from training, because I don't know that any specific modality, like type of training, has a unique sort of like, oh, we'll do this in this specific case. So we can just talk about soreness more generally. And so I believe that this individual is talking about delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS. And this is pain, stiffness, and tenderness in the muscles that starts in the hours following a workout, peaks within 24 to 72 hours before gradually subsiding. Now, there's still a lot of uncertainty around the mechanisms, like what causes DOMS, though it is pretty clear that loaded eccentric exercise is required. That's exercise where the muscle is actively lengthening, so like the downward phase of a squat, for example, or a bench press. New exercises and or higher training loads likely increase the risk and severity of DOMS, though age and sex don't seem to be related. So it's highly likely that anyone who is serious about training or who regularly engages in formalized exercise, they're going to experience delayed onset muscle soreness. If it's happening all the time, that suggests that the training load, likely volume, the proximity to failure, and or the intensity, so the amount of weight that's being lifted, are too great for the individual. Usually a combination of all of those things. And if somebody never experiences delayed onset muscle soreness, it's probably likely that their training load isn't high enough to sort of get all of the potential gains they could have from engaging in exercise. Perhaps paradoxically, so continued training, even when you're sore, can reduce the severity of DOMS. So that's not really preventing delayed onset muscle soreness, but more of like a symptomatic or therapeutic treatment. You can call it therapeutic exercise if you like. So when faced with the idea of like, how would you prevent DOMS? That's different than treating it, right? When you start thinking about prevention of people getting sore or reducing the severity of soreness, what do you start thinking about, Austin?
Yeah, there's going to be probably I'm imagining a scenario where I'm working with somebody and they're like, that's their main concern, is wanting to prevent soreness. And so I think some conversation would be in order at that time point to set some of the expectations that you just mentioned of like, well, what does soreness mean to you? And I expect somebody who's asking that might be like, well, the last time I tried to exercise, I got so sore that I was like laid up in bed and I couldn't move for 2 weeks, or maybe it was so bad that they actually like got rhabdo, and then that's what they mean by sore. It's like, yeah, okay, there are different ways to go about this, but just any soreness at all is not necessarily something that you need to prevent altogether, especially when you're starting to do something new. If it's something that's tolerable, doesn't limit you in the subsequent days, I would, try to reset some of those expectations. But I'm not trying to just like gaslight this person either necessarily and like, brainwash them into saying that this is never a thing that you're going to experience, but rather that it's just a kind of an expected response to a novel training stimulus. Or some of these other variables that you mentioned. It reminds me a little bit of our conversation on the last podcast episode around IBS and like FODMAP diets and sensitivity, to where two people might have a similar, amount of distension in their gut, and one person might experience it as a little bit more unpleasant than someone else. I feel like you or I, if we do some training and we get sore, it's almost like a borderline enjoyable kind of sensation in the next day or two, because it's like pretty uncommon for us to experience it at this point. And so there is this kind of subjective experiential aspect to it. And so if you're able to reframe what soreness means to you, like, oh, it means I at least likely got a reasonable training stimulus from this session. That's not to say if you didn't get sore, you don't get sore, that you're not getting a reasonable training stimulus. But so there's just some initial conversation at play. And then the rest of it comes down to if we want to mitigate it as much as possible, then I guess the idea would be adjusting the dose and the novelty of the training stimulus to be as like small and incremental as possible. If I was like new to training and I was like, I don't ever want to feel a bit of soreness during this whole training journey, then like your first session is going to be like a set of 3 with the bar, and then that's it. You're done for the day, right? So making the increments and the dosage, starting it super low and incrementing it super slowly, I think would probably be the best way up front to like prevent feeling soreness, if that was your goal at the outset.
Yeah, I actually think that maybe there's like an expectation continuum here, right? So if you're maybe a preference continuum, so if your preference is to never feel sore, I think that you're likely going to leave a substantial amount of fitness-related adaptations on the table, because you'll never get close to like your maximum training load that you can tolerate. And then on the other side of that spectrum, if you're like, I must feel like crazy sore after every workout because that's the only way you know that it's working, I think you're actually out kicking your coverage more often than not, and you're also going to be a little stymied there. And so you'd want to be somewhere in the middle. You'd want to be, sometimes I'm sore and sometimes I'm not.
Yeah.
When I think about prevention, I just kind of automatically try to come up with different categories for like risk factors that I think would actually increase soreness. So I think about extrinsic factors, intrinsic factors, program-specific factors, and environmental factors, just broadly speaking. So extrinsic factors would be things like sleep. So sleep deprivation, for example, we know that people tend to report or have signs of an increase experience in training stress if they're sleep deprived compared to that same training if they are not sleep deprived. So if somebody was going through a phase of like sleep deprivation, sleep restriction, whatever, life stress was real high and causing some sleep related issues, that would be a time to concomitantly reduce total training load, like maybe as a preventative or prophylactic strategy there. Another extrinsic factor would be nutrition. And the two major ones here are just total energy intake. So like if it's Ramadan, for example, maybe that's not the time for your highest sort of training load because we do worry about total energy intake if it's not available to you. Or if somebody's in like a dieting phase, it is possible that if they have like a pretty significant energy deficit that, you know, they're just run out of total calories to support their activity levels. I don't really know that that's going to happen in resistance training too much, but I think about like more endurance focused activities, people trying to prepare for ultras or marathons or something like that. And they're also trying to lose weight. It's like, you really just need to feed your activity level at this time. It's probably not the greatest time to lose weight. And then protein would be the other one. There's pretty good evidence here that if there's a protein insufficiency, that people will report higher levels of soreness, which is exceedingly rare in modern society, particularly in the United States. We just tend to eat a pretty high amount of protein, even if it's not as much as you need to like maximize gains. And so in the research, if once people get up to that at 1.4, 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of total body weight per day, I think people can check the box for protein. Higher than that may be a personal preference, and it may be better for some like muscle-related outcomes like muscle mass, muscle strength, muscle preservation, perhaps in a cut. But like if you're eating less than that and you're sore pretty regularly, that is kind of an easy fix if you can stomach the protein and the price of it. Intrinsic factors, I start thinking about mood. So some decent evidence regarding anxiety and depression, and it seems to correlate with more severe experience of DOMS. And so I could think about, you have a person who has no sort of mental health issue, right? And they're running a training program and they're off to the races. They're thriving. Yeah, things are going great. And then they develop major depressive disorder, for example, and they're like, why am I sore all the time? It's like, well, this is multifactorial. Like you're just maybe more sensitive to that same sort of training stimulus like you talked about earlier with IBS. And so they feel more soreness, experience more soreness. Or it could also cause other effects with nutrition. Perhaps they're eating less. They might be sleeping less. And so it could be more complicated than just the mood itself. It could have other knock-on effects. I think about program-specific factors. You talked about this already. So new exercises, the like more novel on exercises, particularly if it has a pretty big eccentric component. Yeah, that's a recipe for increased soreness, especially if the amount of reps, sets, and total training load is high, and then even more so if the proximity to failure is pretty close. So I can imagine a situation, I'm trying to think of an exercise you haven't done in a while, Austin. I'm thinking overhead press. You don't like overhead pressing, for example. Although maybe that's not a great example because there's not a lot of eccentric there. So maybe... What is an exercise that you don't necessarily do a lot of that has a long eccentric?
I've been doing super varied training recently, and it's actually been more challenging to find something that gets me
sore.
gets me sore.
Yeah,
I mean, I imagine like if I flipped the question and had you do like sissy squats loaded on a hack squat machine or something like that.
Yeah.
That's probably a fair amount of eccentric load across the quads that you're not used to handling. Or like if I had you do, reasonably heavy like single leg dumbbell RDLs or something like that you're not ready for. That would be another example.
Yeah, long eccentric, taking it all the way to failure, close to, significantly worse than a more moderate amount of volume and a little bit further away from failure. So you would probably initiate a person, their first experience to these exercises, first exposure would be less total reps and sets, staying further away from failure, and then you can gradually increase that over time as the person's able to tolerate it. And training status is another big one that's program specific. So if a person is very, very well trained and has had a wide variety of different exercises that they've had exposure to, there's some transference of this thing we call repeated bout effect, the RBE. Basically, that suggests that people get less muscular damage to an exercise that they've already done, and there seems to be some transference between similar exercises. So, for example, squat. A regular squat with no pause is one type of exercise, whereas a pause squat is a different type of squat. And I would expect there to be good transference with respect to like muscular damage that you would experience from those two exercises. So the more trained a person is, I would expect the less soreness. So just like you kind of basically just said, you're like, dude, I've been doing a lot of weird stuff, so try to make me sore.
Right.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. The last thing I think about here, just as far as major factors that would be generalizable to most folks, is the environment. And I don't, mean necessarily like, oh, what gym did you train at? But if it's really hot, for example, and or the environment is harsh and so hydration status becomes an issue, yeah, those things would all tend to increase soreness and actually increase risk of like rhabdomyolysis, so exertional rhabdo, and then also like heat-related illness too. So if you're in a hotter environment, maybe you live in El Paso, Texas, and your gym is not air-conditioned, for example, that might not be a great time for your highest volume, highest training load sort of session. And then you mentioned underlying medical issues. I was going to see if you discuss this. You want to talk about metabolic like issues or like
I'm imagining I've seen patients before who maybe they're not habitual exercisers, but if they have kind of these subacute or chronic kind of muscle aches or disproportionate muscle aches or soreness in response to trivial amounts of activity. I remember admitting an older lady once who was just doing her routine housework and she was getting super sore, and she came in and we actually found out that she was in rhabdo. And we're like, tell us about this housework. And it actually sounded pretty routine, not terribly high effort. And she ended up having a myositis. She had a condition called polymyositis, an autoimmune attack on your own muscle cells. And so there are a variety of underlying muscle conditions that can increase the risk of this kind of thing or predispose you to it. And I obviously don't say this to have anybody who feels sore to go get tested for a bunch of these things, but rather if it seems very disproportionate, or if someone has recurrent episodes of rhabdo that don't seem to be, again, proportionate to the stimulus that they have been exposing themselves to in training, I do start to wonder about muscle disorders, myopathies, myositis, mitochondrial conditions, especially if they're young, or certain medications that can increase the risk of muscle disorders like this. So there are some underlying medical things to think about, especially if it's, again, disproportionate or recurrent severe episodes of this that you wouldn't have expected from the novelty of the activity or the dose of activity.
Yeah. Good feedback. We discuss delayed onset muscle soreness and more in podcast episode 298. I've linked that in the description below.